Hi, my name's Phil. I'd like to talk about politics. So I discussed one way in which the Russian economy could genuinely be unravelling right now at the weekend over the collapse of their coal export value. But maybe we don't have to pin our hopes entirely on economic pressures bringing Putin to the negotiating table. Stupid evil seems to be in full swing in Russian-controlled Donetsk, where Russian soldiers cannot even refuel their vehicles for combat missions because they need coupons, which you'd think the Russian state would prioritise for their invasion force. But it seems not. But first, for daily news and politics, please click the subscribe button to stay notified. So this is vaguely insane. A Russian soldier filmed his quest to get fuel for military vehicles in the Donetsk region of Ukraine, which Russia currently occupies. First of all, the Russian state isn't actually supplying its own invasion force with enough fuel for operations, which sounds a bit mad in itself for an oil-producing and refining nation. Maybe those Ukrainian flamingos hit too many refineries for Putin's liking. Still, for a country prioritising resources to the military, not supplying your forces inside Ukraine seems surprising, doesn't it? But it gets better. This soldier seemingly just thought, sod it, I'll just go to a petrol station, pay for the fuel myself. Which at least means that soldier's getting paid, I guess. Only they couldn't. Russia has initiated a system of payment for fuel in the region using coupons. And this soldier doesn't have the coupon, so he can't buy the fuel. So not only is the Kremlin not supplying their own invasion force with enough fuel to invade, but they won't even give them coupons to fill up at the local Shell, or whatever it is, Shelsky, I suppose. The soldier explains that he needs the fuel for military operations, but there's nothing the vendor can do. She's got her instructions right. No coupon, no gasoline. Except he sort of could, because there's a thriving black market. Traders outside the petrol station selling the fuel for cash, selling the coupons for cash, I think, as well. So it seems that in the Russian-controlled parts of Donetsk, shady crooks can get the coupons and the fuel, but not their own military forces. Sounds about right for the way wider Russian government works. And this is just one isolated story of utter dysfunction with Russia's military. The shit show was widely reported on in the early days of the full-scale invasion in 2022. You know, tanks stuck in the mud, tyres bursting because they'd perish with age and lack of rotation, other vehicles being nicked by Ukrainian tractors, Russian combat commanders having to use mobile phones, which are easily hacked into, to coordinate because their military radios were shit. But they don't seem to have improved their command and supply structures much since then. It may well be that Putin's military structure and economy are in a race to see which can collapse first. I mean, the first and most devastating fracture in Putin's war machine is the human one. An army is only as strong as its soldiers, of course, and Russia's are being systematically broken. By mid-2025, I think the latest data we've got, the sheer scale of losses became impossible to hide. US and UK intelligence estimated that Russia has suffered casualties approaching like 1 million men, with fatalities aimed at somewhere between, I think it was 219,000, 250,000. Now, to put that in perspective, that is more Russian deaths than in their wars in Afghanistan, Chechnya, Georgia, and Syria combined. At times, the monthly casualty rates have been absolutely staggering. All part of the big book of Russian military strategy, which contains just a single chapter entitled Throw More Men into the Meat Grinder. And to fill this ever-widening gap, the Kremlin has turned to reckless recruitment. It has thrown tens, if not hundreds of thousands of prisoners into the fight, including violent prisoners. They're not professional soldiers, not been trained. Many are drawn from impoverished remote villages, lured by cash incentives that their families desperately need, because, you know, their economy is knackered. They've become economic conscripts, like 200 years ago. That's how they got people into the army 250 years ago in Europe. Well, you're really poor, you see, because we've nicked all your money. How about going to war for a shilling? Not remotely motivated by nationalist fervour, and certainly not by patriotism, right? This desperation has created a toxic environment on the front. The army is reportedly collapsing from within due to a catastrophic breakdown in morale. Incidents of soldiers shooting their own comrades, rampant looting have become common signs of a loss of command and control. Ukrainian intelligence reports a massive spike in desertions, with soldiers abandoning their units due to unbearable service conditions, including severe supply shortages and the frequent use of so-called meat assaults, which is where you have you've got, well, literally throwing them over the top, World War I style, frontal attacks with little regard for survival. In some of the most ridiculous reports, Russian soldiers have been effectively sacrificed. They've been filmed tied to trees as bait for Ukrainian drones. And this decay extends to the top. The war has been marked by command purges and the arrests of high-ranking generals, which further destabilizes a chaotic leadership structure. And this crisis is hollowing out Russia's future. The war has triggered a massive brain drain. There's been an estimated, something like 300,000 engineers, scientists, IT specialists having fled Russia since 2022, which of course would be the people that you'd think you'd need to build the next generation of technology in Russia. Instead, it finds itself increasingly dependent on North Korean artillery and Iranian drones just to keep fighting. A clear sign of strategic bankruptcy. I mean, how far has a former superpower fallen when it needs North Korea to supply it with troops and weapons? And it's not just a lack of troops dooming Russia, it's their failing equipment as well. Second fractures material. The myth of Russia's endless Soviet arsenal has met the harsh reality of a high-intensity war. When the invasion began, the Kremlin relied on brute force, throwing its massive Cold War reserves at the problem. They tried a bit of a blitzkrieg, didn't quite work. That strategy has had an expiration date, and that expiration date has arrived. The volume of military equipment being shipped from deep storage has plummeted. What's left is older and harder to repair. That is why you've got tanks from the 1950s being used for infantry support. The losses on the battlefield are staggering. Since the start of the war, the Russian military has lost over 11,000 main battle tanks, a number that is more than 3 times its entire pre-war active infantry and roughly equivalent to the entire active tank force of NATO in Europe. Repeated Ukrainian strikes on strategic airfields have also damaged or destroyed irreplaceable long-range bombers that form the backbone of Russia's strike capability, right? Which is why they're having to now lean more into drones. And this decay is accelerated by Western sanctions, of course, which have damaged Russia's ability to produce modern weaponry. While propaganda boasts of increased production, the reality is that beyond those drones, where Russia actually is developing new systems, much of this is simply refurbished old equipment. You know, the production of modern T-90 tanks, for example. That's estimated at between about 15 to 25 a month. Meanwhile, industrial output is hampered by supply chain disruptions, but also labour shortages, driven by both mobilisation and the brain drain. I mean, if you have a policy of conducting war by just throwing more grunts at the guns, you're going to run out of factory workers. Maybe Putin could try sending some of the Moscow or St. Petersburg elite to man the factories. The impact is being felt across the front. Ukrainian drone strikes on Russian refineries have taken a significant portion of Russia's oil refining capacity offline, leading to fuel shortages in over 20 regions and forcing Moscow to import fuel. These strikes have exposed a critical vulnerability, threatening the revenues that fund the entire war. The Kremlin now appears to be deprioritising its aircraft industry to conserve funds for immediate battlefield needs like drones and artillery, a move that sacrifices long-term power for short-term survival. This isn't a military superpower. It's a creaking machine being stripped for parts just to keep moving. And think about how this is likely to play out. If, as reports suggest, Russia really is focusing now on short-term, day-to-day survival, Putin is basically praying for some sort of miracle. He gives the outward appearance of someone who's in this for the long term and is happy to just wait until his enemies surrender. Perhaps he thought Trump would force this, but although he is still dangling the orange one on a string, Trump is getting benefits from supporting Ukraine in some fashion as well. He's also now getting benefits from applying a few sanctions to Russia because those sanctions result in people buying more LNG from America. So it now seems doubtful that Putin could persuade Trump to pull all support for Ukraine. Putin is trying to pretend he can ride out a war of attrition, but the facts on the ground just seem to be pointing in a very different direction. Between an economy that is collapsing under the weight of sanctions and oligarch incompetence, and a military which he cannot even supply with fuel, it becomes increasingly difficult to see how the current stalemate can really last that much longer. I mean, I struggle to see the circumstances under which Putin can agree to stop the fighting and survive as Russia's strongman leader. But I also struggle to see how he can really keep this going for a long time as well. But let me know what you think in the comments below. For more content, you could subscribe to the channel or even join for access to streams and behind the scenes updates. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.